Hello, my name is Recky, and welcome back for another freaky deaky. Well, maybe not. It's MrBallen time, and I gotta be honest with you. I really love just walking around like a moron. Oh, look at that, like a tourist. Maybe like a tourist in New York, watching all the things around you. That's how I feel when I walk around Mr. Ballen's uh, channel. It's so much things I want to check out, and I know that you guys really do enjoy me doing reactions to Mr. Ballin. If you haven't checked out Mr. Ballin yet, I strongly advise that you do. You find the link for the video we're gonna watch, and of course, for the freaking channel, located right down here in my description. Go there and give them the support that they so much deserve. The video we're gonna watch is, of course, 2 weeks old. And the reason why it actually caught my attention was a disaster you never heard of is still controlling our timeline. What in the hell you talking about, Mr. Ballin? And that got my attention. If I did get your attention, don't forget to smack the like and of course hit that subscribe. That is something I would greatly appreciate. Thank you. Before we watch, we say thank you so much to the channel members and the Patreon. Thank you so much for the excellent support. A big shout out to the Supreme Tier donators over by Patreon and of course on channel membership. Thank you. Really kind of you. Very kind. Personal shout outs goes to the ultimate supporters, only available on Patreon, I think. Maybe. I have no idea. I'm sorry. Deja, Walt, Dwayne, Dana, Troy, Robert, Matt, Lon, and Barbara. That's a kick-ass list right there, isn't it? Thank you, guys. Thank you. If you haven't checked out my other channel called Recky and Carol, me and Carol doing some funny things together, like everything that is America, basically. So go check it out. Somewhere up here. I think I can manage to do that. All right, shut up, Recky. No one cares. Oh, really? No one cares? I got 16 minutes, almost 17 minutes, and it's going to be amazing. I'm going to see if I could maybe... Oh, here we go.
So after taking a deep breath, he flipped the switch.
All right, I need to call back here. I think everything should be good.
In 1944, an American military pilot was flying over England when he turned around in his cockpit and looked at the...
Let's go back. Let's do this again.
One night in 1944, an American military pilot was flying over England when he turned around in his cockpit and looked at this panel of switches that was right behind him. And after looking for a particular switch, he reached out and he was about to toggle it, but he stopped because he knew what he was about to do, flipping this switch, would easily be the most dangerous thing he had ever done in his entire life.
But did he say British? Did he say British? If it was an American pilot, I would say like Nagasaki, Hiroshima, like nuclear bombs they dropped on Japan during Second World War. But I think he said Britain. And did they have British?
But this was his duty. He had to do it. And so after taking a deep breath, he flipped the switch. And immediately, chaos ensued, and the course of American history would be drastically changed forever. If you've never heard the story before, and many people have not, this is not nearly as well known as it should be, then you are in for a huge reveal at the end. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please secretly log in to the Like Button's computer and then transfer all of their Bitcoin to your untraceable offshore account. Also, please subscribe to our channel.
I have an offshore account.
And turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story.
Very keen on this one. I'm very curious. Wires crossed. Wires crossed.
At around 5:30 p.m. on the evening of August 12, 1944, a young American military pilot named Joe walked out of his quarters on his base in England where he was stationed. And as soon as he was
Oh.
outside, he lit a cigarette to calm his nerves, and as he smoked the cigarette, he began walking towards the huge hangar on the other side of the base where his plane was waiting for him. Joe had been preparing for this night for weeks. He and his co-pilot, a 35-year-old lieutenant who was nicknamed Bud, were about to step off on a top-secret military mission called Operation Aphrodite. And this mission was not only top secret, but it was so unbelievably dangerous that basically anybody who knew about it considered it a suicide mission. But Joe tried not to think about that as he walked towards the hangar. Instead, he tried to think
I always see myself as quite knowledgeable when it comes to Second World War, but I can't really find anything in my brain library about Aphrodite. Is it still Did they drop more bombs than the nukes? Like, did they bomb mainland of Japan and they ran out of fuel, like Pearl Harbor thing? I don't know. I don't think so.
about the reason he was here in the first place, the reason he had joined the military, and that was to defeat the Nazis. And what he and his co-pilot were about to do, Operation Aphrodite, was going to play a huge role in defeating the Nazis. So this was about 5 years into World War II, and at this point, the Nazis were actually losing. However, it was making them more dangerous, not less, because they were becoming very, very desperate. And so they were launching all these outrageous attacks, basically because they had nothing to lose. And one horrible thing the Nazis were doing at this time were dropping these things called vengeance weapons. Hitler called them vengeance weapons. They were basically these huge bombs that the Nazis would drop arbitrarily across the United Kingdom on major population centers. And by this point in the war, these vengeance weapons had killed over 5,000 civilians. And at this exact moment, like this night, as Joe was walking towards the hangar, the Nazis had a stash of vengeance weapons aimed directly at London. That was going to be their next target. And so the mission that Joe and his co-pilot Bud were going on, Operation Aphrodite, was going to be to go out and destroy those vengeance weapons to save London. And as nervous as Joe was about this mission, and he was really nervous, he was also very excited. He actually had volunteered for this mission when many other pilots had done everything they could to stay away from this mission. And on top of that, Joe actually had flown enough missions by this point in the war that he didn't need to fly anymore. He could just go home. But instead, he volunteered for this mission. And a reason why Joe might have decided to do that has a lot to do with the family he was raised in. So Joe came from a family that was very successful and accomplished, and his father really pushed Joe and his younger brother to be the very best at whatever they were doing and to be very competitive with each other. And so while Joe and his younger brother did love each other, they also had a pretty intense rivalry. And for a while, Joe's father obviously favored Joe. I mean, Joe was the favorite child, and, his father would always say, Joe's going to be the president someday. He's so talented. But after the attack on Pearl Harbor that brought the United States into World War II, both Joe and his younger brother joined the military.
That picture, let's see if I can go back. Of course I cannot. If just take a look at this picture. I don't know if you guys can see. I'm trying to keep it not too big or not too small, not too big for being copyrighted and not too small. You guys can actually not see it. But what we can see here is a bunch of dudes around the airplanes. Here there's a hangar and on the left side, and there's a huge like a mushroom cloud just on the horizon. Wow.
Harbor that brought the United States into World War II, both Joe and his younger brother joined the military, and pretty early on in the war, Joe's younger brother got an award for heroism. He had basically saved his platoon of men, and he won all these awards, and he was all over the news, and pretty quickly after that, Joe felt like he fell out of favor with his dad, that his dad kind of looked at the younger brother as being the favorite child now. And so Joe really started to feel insecure and wanted to prove himself really to his dad. And so when Operation Aphrodite came up, Joe volunteered for it really because he wanted to be a hero. He wanted to show his dad that he too could do something huge and change the course of history. And he would change the course of history, but not in the way he expected. And so Joe continued to smoke a cigarette and hustled across the base towards the hangar. And as he did, he found himself kind of speeding up, like he just wanted to get over there and get started. Joe's commanders had given him a special code he would call out over the radio if this mission was successful. It was spade flush. That's what he'd say over the radio. And so as Joe hustled towards the hangar, he imagined how incredible it was going to be to yell out spade flush over the radio. I mean, it was only like 30 minutes away from that moment. This was a short mission. And so finally, Joe reached the hangar and he looked up to the sky one more time to make sure the weather looked solid, because actually they had tried to launch Operation Aphrodite a couple of days earlier, but it had been canceled because of fog. But Joe looked around and the weather looked good, and so he knew it was going to be a go. So he flipped his cigarette butt and stepped into the hangar. Inside this hangar was this massive big open space, and in the center of the hangar on the floor was this huge plane called a B-24 Liberator. This was of course Joe's plane for the night. And so Joe immediately began walking towards the plane to check it out. Now, this particular type of plane was the type of plane Joe had been flying for the past 3 years. I mean, he'd flown many combat missions in this type of aircraft.
It's one of the cool bombers of Second World War, right? Is it B-24 or B-24 Liberator?
So he was very familiar with it. But this particular B-24 was unlike any of the other B-24s Joe had ever flown. In fact, this aircraft was so unique, it was unlike any aircraft that any pilot in the American military had ever flown. I mean, this was really a one of one. And so as Joe walked around the outside of this plane, he began to notice some of these unique modifications that the mechanics had made to this aircraft. The most noticeable modification was actually the cockpit. Now, normally the cockpit had all these windows basically all around it, so the pilot could look in any direction and see what was going on, but obviously they needed to be protected from the elements. But this B-24 had all the glass removed except for one pane of glass basically right in front of where Joe would be staring, just like a single windshield. And so it's almost like it was a convertible aircraft where it was all open air in the cockpit. And the reason for this change is because Joe and his co-pilot, during the course of this top secret mission, Operation Aphrodite, they would have to jump out and parachute to the ground. And so by having this all open, it would allow them to do that much easier. And then another big modification to the B-24 is the guns that were normally located on the outside of the aircraft were gone, and they were replaced by broomsticks painted black to look like guns at a distance. But the visible changes to this particular B-24...
I do believe that they took a couple... I recognize this, but I'm not going to say that I'm 100% sure, but I do believe that they did this because of the heaviness of the airplane. They want to make it go faster, I think. So they took out a couple of things to make it go faster. I'm not sure. This is engineer Recky just speculating. And all you all know, I'm not an engineer, so let's just pretend I should shut up and just continue watch the video. Like, yeah, cool.
Were nothing compared to the massive changes that were hidden inside this aircraft. Because the top secret part of Operation Aphrodite was really this particular plane. The plane was not really a plane. It was more like a huge flying bomb. The military's mechanics basically hollowed out the entirety of this plane, removed everything inside of it that was not absolutely vital, and they replaced it with explosives. 10 tons of explosives. Like, this is an unbelievable amount of explosives. A few minutes later, at around 5:55 p.m., Joe and his co-pilot Bud, who by this point had...
So they're gonna crash this airplane on location, pinpoint location, Vengeance Weapons Factory warehouse in Germany.
Come into the hangar, finished doing their exterior inspection of the aircraft, and then they climbed into the cockpit, with Joe taking a seat in the pilot's seat and Bud sitting in the co-pilot's seat. And even though the evening was cool, both men were visibly sweating. Once the pilots got the go-ahead to begin the mission, Joe fired the first engine and then turned to look at the ground crew all around them, and he noticed all of them looked really, really serious. I mean, they obviously knew how intensely dangerous this mission really was, and the fact was, you know, the pilots might not make it home, and so they're looking up at these guys like, I'm sorry you have to do this. But Joe, you know, he looked out at these people and he sensed that was going on, and so he made a big show to wave and smile at them, to show confidence, like he knew what he was going to do. He's going to...
Joe is a badass, all right? Joe is a badass.
Be fine. But in reality, Joe really was terrified.
Yeah. I would be too.
In about 10 seconds, I'm going to hold something up in front of the camera that our team has been working on for over a year, and it's finally ready to be revealed, and we know you're going to love it. All right, drum roll please, here we go. And it's the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious delivered in book format. The official MrBallen graphic novel, our first book ever. In this just stunningly beautiful anthology of stories are full stories that are brand new and have never been covered anywhere else on any of our other channels. So if you want to hear those new stories, you got to get this book. The book is not coming out until my birthday, October 1st of this year, but you can pre-order a book right now by going to book.ballenstudios.com. The link is also in the description. And if enough of you pre-order this thing, it'll make the New York Times bestseller list, which is so cool, but more importantly, that will show us there's big interest in books from the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious community, and we'll make more of them. So again, head on over to book.ballenstudios.com and pre-order a copy today. Oh, and also at the end of today's video, be sure you stick around because I'm going to go live on YouTube, and during this live event, I will tell you a little personal story from my time in Navy boot camp and how that actually led to the creation of this graphic novel. I'll also speak with some very special people that helped make this book a reality, and I'll share some other exclusive details about the book. Oh, and also I will answer any questions you might have about the book. So when this episode ends, just click on the live tab on my YouTube channel to join the live event with me. And again, go to book.ballenstudios.com and pre-order a copy of the MrBallen graphic novel today and help us get on that New York Times bestsellers list. By 5:59 p.m., Joe had all 4 propellers spinning on the aircraft, and so he released the brake and began taxiing out to the runway. And as they bumped along, Joe and Bud became really aware of just how heavy this aircraft was from all the explosives. I mean, every bump, this plane is lurching up and down and really creaking and making lots of noises. I mean, this was sketchy. Finally, Joe went full speed ahead, and he and Joe went tearing down the runway, and at some point, the plane did get lift, and it took off into the air. And then just up ahead of him were 6 other planes that had just taken off moments before, who were going to escort Joe and Bud to their target area. Once Joe got the plane to its cruising altitude, he and Bud kind of relaxed for a second.
I gotta say, I got a weird bad feeling, but yet again, every time I think about the actual mission that they're gonna do, I'm actually getting such a goosebumps feeling. I feel like it's gonna be one of those moments where being heroic is not even enough. Inhumane, mentally psycho thing to do for freedom, for liberty, and freaking justice for all.
And began preparing themselves for what was going to happen next. They had about 15 minutes of just kind of casual flying before the real work of this mission began. The vengeance weapons that Joe and Bud were going out to destroy as part of Operation Aphrodite were located about 120 miles south, just outside of this little town in the very northern tip of France. But destroying these weapons would not be as simple as just Joe and Bud flying over top and releasing all their explosives and flying back home, because the Nazis had buried these vengeance weapons deep inside the hills in this town in northern France. And so regular bombs wouldn't touch these vengeance weapons. They had to do it a different way. And the way they were going to do it was Joe and Bud were going to fly their plane
Get out of town. They cannot fly into the entrance.
Directly into the hills. And the way they would do this is they would fly their plane as close to the target area as possible, at which point one of the other pilots that were in the escort planes would take remote control of the B-24 flying bomb. And then once they had remote control, Joe and Bud, who no longer needed to do anything, they would jump out and parachute to the ground. And then the pilot who was remotely flying this now vacant.
Is anyone actually thinking about that they actually could do this in the 1940s? I'm going to remote control that like it was an unmanned airplane. It's a freaking UAV here. Let me know if you did did you know that they can do this in as early as 1940s? That they actually can do unmanned airplanes. I am completely blown away by that one. Holy crap.
B-24 flying bomb, they would just set it on autopilot to crash into the hills. At around 6:15 p.m., just as the English Channel came into view, Joe toggled a switch on his control panel, and then after he did, he and Bud kind of held their breath for a second to see what would happen. And then a couple of seconds later, the plane kind of shuddered for a second and then leveled out. And then a call came over the radio from one of the pilots who were in the escort planes telling Joe and Bud that they had just successfully taken remote control of the B-24. So at this point, Joe and Bud are no longer flying the aircraft. They're just sitting inside of this flying bomb. Now, there were only two things left for Joe and Bud to do before they could bail out to safety. They would need to arm the plane, so basically arm the explosives and make them ready to detonate. And then after that was done, they would need to call out over the radio, spade flush, the code Joe was given, which would signal to everybody else that the plane was ready and Joe and Bud were jumping out. And so once Joe and Bud nodded to each other and kind of acknowledged that, okay, we're going to do the last bit of this mission, Joe turned around in his seat and he looked at this control panel that was right behind him, and on this panel was the arming switch. And so once Joe flipped this, he and Bud would have a very short window of time to safely escape the aircraft. And so it was kind of like, flip it, make the radio call, and get the heck out of there. But Joe and Bud had trained for this moment over and over and over again, so they were ready. And so eventually, Joe flipped the switch, grabbed his radio, and called out, spade flush. What Joe and Bud could not have known when the mechanics were making all these modifications to this B-24 was that one of the mechanics accidentally crossed some wires in putting in all these explosives. And so just seconds after Joe had armed the explosives, they detonated. They were not supposed to, but they did. And so Joe and Bud were killed basically a fraction of a second after calling out spade flush. But it would turn out the catastrophic failure of Operation Aphrodite had no impact on World War II. In fact, Operation Aphrodite should never have happened in the first place. It was totally unnecessary. What Joe and Bud and the rest of the American military didn't know at the time was 5 weeks earlier, the British Royal Air Force dropped a whole bunch of ground-penetrating bombs all across those hills in northern France, and they destroyed all of the vengeance weapons. So when Joe and Bud took off on this doomed mission, there was no threat to London.
Good comms, people. Thank you for letting us know that you have already done the mission, and we actually lost 2 guys in an airplane. So thank you for that. Thank you. Next time we should be communicating better, and let's not do this ever again. Yeah, thank you.
None. But that is not the big reveal in this story, because Operation Aphrodite changed the course of American history in a really specific and really enormous way. Because Joe, whose full name was Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., was a member of the very famous Kennedy family, a big-time political family in America. And at the time, the Kennedys were all saying Joseph is going to be the next president of the United States. And everybody believed it. He was going to be the guy. But then, of course, Operation Aphrodite changed all of that because Joseph was killed. And so the war would end about a year later, and when it did, Joseph's younger brother, John F. Kennedy, who won that award for heroism and got a Purple Heart early on in the war, and he kind of became a war hero, which prompted Joe to volunteer for Operation Aphrodite. Yeah, John would begin his unbelievable political rise. And by 1960, John F. Kennedy, JFK, would become the 35th president of the United States, even though he wasn't supposed to. He was the second choice. It should have been Joe.
And then JFK got shot.
As I mentioned earlier, I am now going to go live on YouTube to discuss further our big announcement, our graphic novel. All you have to do to join this live event.
Yeah, I'm sorry, MrBallen. You are not live now. I am quite sure of it. Okay, I gotta tell you. I am completely mind blown. I never heard of Aphrodite before. This is actually the first time. And what a complete freaking waste it was. I can't believe this. This is the stories that you get from maybe the Fat Electrician or something like that. And you actually got this from MrBallen. Mind blowing. I am super happy that I actually clicked that button. Amazing. I'm very sad for one of the Kennedys, but they had serious bad luck, so it's bound to happen, wasn't it? Let me know what you think about this. Was this completely new to you, the Aphrodite? And of course, that this actually was probably gonna be the next United States president or president over United States. Mind blowing. I love this. If you did too, smack the like. Of course, hit that subscribe. I would greatly appreciate that. And of course, until next time, I'm Recky. You stay safe.